Catherine woke up every single morning, long before the sun had even a chance to paint the horizon. It was not because she had a glamorous career or an early shift waiting for her, but rather because the heavy weight of financial worry refused to let her sleep a moment past dawn. Her small apartment in the historic heart of Boston, Massachusetts, was incredibly modest, yet it was kept with an immaculate level of care that bordered on reverence. Every single piece of old furniture was perfectly aligned, every plate was spotless, and every book was stacked precisely by size, as if maintaining absolute outer order could somehow compensate for the absolute chaos her life had become over the past several months. Ever since she had been abruptly and unfairly dismissed from the Metropolitan Hospital, where she had served faithfully as a highly skilled paramedic, her entire daily existence had been turned completely upside down. She could still vividly remember the chilling coldness of that afternoon when she was summoned into the director's office, listening to hollow clinical explanations about corporate restructuring and internal budget cutbacks. However, Catherine knew the real reason behind her termination had a very specific name and a highly influential title attached to it. Raymond, her powerful ex-husband, was a highly respected and heavily connected senior physician within that very same medical network, and he simply could not accept the fact that she had gathered the courage to end their deeply unhappy marriage. He had chosen to use his immense professional leverage and professional friendships to systematically destroy her career out of pure, unadulterated malice. For a long number of years, Raymond had controlled virtually every aspect of her existence within the walls of their former home, constantly minimizing her personal decisions, harshly criticizing her choices, and making her feel entirely insignificant. When she finally walked away to protect her own sanity, he made it his personal mission to prove that he could control her professional survival just as easily as he had controlled her personal life. Despite the overwhelming weight of his vindictive actions, Catherine absolutely refused to allow herself to fall apart or sink into a state of permanent despair. During the painful years of their marriage, while Raymond was foolishly squandering massive amounts of money on fleeting luxuries, expensive sports cars, and superficial high society appearances, she had quietly and disciplinedly saved every spare dollar she could manage. It certainly was not a massive fortune by any means, but it was just enough to provide a small bit of financial breathing room during this incredibly dark period of unemployment. Thanks to the rigorous financial discipline she had practiced throughout her entire adult life, she was still able to provide the absolute bare necessities for herself and her young daughter, Beatrice. Their daily meals had become exceptionally simple, consisting primarily of white rice, fresh seasonal vegetables, and boiled eggs, ensuring that not a single scrap of food was ever wasted under their roof. The monthly electricity bill was monitored with an extreme level of strictness. Water was used only when absolutely necessary, and their existing clothes were constantly mended, adjusted, and mended again with loving care. There was absolutely no room for luxury in their current life, but there was an abundance of quiet dignity that no amount of poverty could ever take away from them. Beatrice, despite being a young girl of only 9 years old, possessed a profound level of emotional maturity that seemed to far exceed her actual age. Every single morning, without fail, the young girl would quietly help her mother set the wooden kitchen table, fold her own clothes into neat squares, and organize her school notebooks before heading out the door. On one particular chilly morning, while Catherine was anxiously calculating their remaining monthly expenses using an old plastic calculator, Beatrice stepped closer, placed her small hand over her mother's trembling fingers, and spoke with absolute certainty. She looked into her mother's tired eyes and told her that they were not truly poor, but were simply walking through a temporary season of hardship that would eventually pass. Catherine could only smile through a sudden rush of hot tears, pulling her daughter close and promising her that this difficult time would definitely not last forever. Beatrice then looked up and reminded her mother that she spent her entire life helping strangers and saving lives, and that the universe would never forget such goodness. That incredibly simple phrase, spoken from the pure heart of a child, was more than enough to completely renew Catherine's fading strength. Later that evening, while they were sharing a quiet dinner of warm vegetable soup, Beatrice looked up from her bowl and softly asked her mother if she deeply missed working at the hospital. Catherine took a long, deep breath, carefully choosing her words so as not to pass her own adult bitterness onto her innocent child. She admitted that she missed the profound fulfillment of saving human lives every day, but she did not miss working alongside individuals who failed to respect her dedication and hard work. The sweet girl immediately reached across the table, squeezed her mother's worn hand, and declared that Catherine would soon find a much better place where people would truly see her worth. It was not just a child speaking empty words of comfort, but a deeply loving daughter, actively trying to shield her mother from the cold winds of discouragement. The bond between them had become an impenetrable fortress, keeping the darkness of their circumstances at bay. On the very next morning, immediately after walking Beatrice to the local elementary school, Catherine sat down in front of her ancient desktop computer, which only continued to function because of her meticulous maintenance. She opened the web browser and began her daily, exhausting search for any available employment opportunities within the greater metropolitan area. She had already sent her extensive resume to dozens of smaller neighborhood clinics, private ambulance companies, and urgent care centers, but Raymond's toxic influence had reached far, and no concrete responses had arrived. It was during this moment of creeping doubt that her eyes caught a completely different kind of job posting on a local employment forum. A massive, multi-million-dollar corporate enterprise, located in the financial district, was actively seeking an experienced full-time office cleaner. The name of the firm's wealthy chief executive officer, Benjamin, was widely known throughout the city, as he had a fierce reputation for being an incredibly demanding, strict, and ruthlessly efficient businessman. For a few fleeting seconds, Catherine hesitated as a wave of natural human pride washed over her, causing her fingers to hover over the keyboard. She had spent years studying advanced medical procedures, handling high-stress emergencies in the back of rushing ambulances, and saving people from the brink of death. Now, she was seriously considering a position that involved emptying trash bins, scrubbing corporate toilets, and mopping marble floors for a living. However, she quickly and decisively pushed her pride away, whispering to herself that any honest, dignified work was worthy of respect. She reminded herself that she had a young daughter to feed, a roof to keep over their heads, and an entire life to rebuild from the absolute ground up. With a firm nod of determination, she updated her resume, highlighting her absolute reliability, organizational skills, and attention to detail, before clicking the Submit button. Only a few hours later, while she was thoroughly scrubbing the small kitchen sink, her old cell phone rang, with a loud, startling clarity. She answered it with a rapidly accelerating heartbeat, trying to keep her voice perfectly steady as the corporate human resources representative spoke on the other end. The voice formally confirmed that the executive office had reviewed her application and wanted to schedule an in-person interview for the very next morning. After hanging up the phone, Catherine stood entirely frozen in the middle of her kitchen for several long moments, slowly absorbing the reality of the news. When the afternoon finally arrived and she went to collect Beatrice from the school gates, she immediately shared the exciting update with her daughter. The young girl's eyes widened with pure delight, and she excitedly reminded her mother that she had predicted something wonderful would happen very soon. Catherine gently explained to her daughter that the job was for a cleaning position, which would be completely different from the prestigious medical work she had done in the past. Beatrice looked at her mother with a striking level of wisdom and firmly stated that the specific job title did not matter at all, because Catherine always performed every task with absolute excellence. That evening, The two of them carefully selected the very best outfit Catherine still owned from her previous life. A simple, dark blue pantsuit that was modest but exceptionally well-tailored. They stood side by side near the ironing board, smoothing out every single wrinkle, while talking quietly about how this interview could mark the official beginning of their financial recovery. Before climbing into her small bed, Beatrice wrapped her arms tightly around her mother's neck and whispered that tomorrow would be the day their luck finally turned around. Catherine smiled warmly and kissed her forehead, though deep down inside her chest, a restless mixture of profound hope and intense fear kept her awake for hours. The next morning arrived with a biting chill, and it was still completely dark outside when Catherine quietly slipped out of bed to prepare breakfast. She brewed a fresh pot of coffee, gently woke her daughter with a soft kiss, and ensured that the apartment was left in absolute, pristine order before she departed. Just as she was about to open the front door, Beatrice caught her by the hands, looked directly into her eyes, and reminded her to remember how incredibly strong she truly was. Catherine squeezed her daughter's hands tightly, responding that her strength came entirely from the love they shared. Before stepping out into the cold morning air, she walked down the quiet city streets with firm, deliberate steps, repeating a silent mantra that this was her ultimate chance to start over. She had absolutely no idea what challenges she would face in the hours ahead, but she possessed a fierce, unshakable certainty that she would never let Raymond or the injustices of her past define their future. Catherine walked at an incredibly brisk pace through the waking streets of Boston, her boots clicking sharply against the cold pavement as she held her purse tightly against her body. The early morning air was crisp and clear, and the city was just beginning to stir with the very first waves of daily commuters. When she was only a few blocks away from the towering glass skyscraper where her interview was scheduled, she noticed an elderly gentleman a short distance ahead of her. The silver-haired man suddenly began to stagger sideways, reaching out a trembling hand to support himself against a cold brick wall, before slowly sliding all the way down to the concrete sidewalk. Several busy pedestrians walked right past him, offering nothing more than a fleeting, indifferent glance, before quickening their steps to catch their morning trains. Catherine stopped dead in her tracks for a single fraction of a second, her sharp clinical instincts instantly recognizing that this was not a simple trip or fall, and she sprinted toward him without a moment of hesitation. As she dropped to her knees on the hard ground beside the unconscious man, she immediately noticed that his breathing was dangerously shallow and his face was entirely devoid of color. The elderly gentleman, whose name was Ethan, was feebly trying to form words, but nothing more than a faint, incoherent murmur could escape his pale lips. Catherine placed a gentle but firm hand on his trembling shoulder, speaking in the calm, authoritative tone she had utilized during 1,000 medical emergencies. She checked his carotid pulse, carefully evaluated the rise and fall of his chest, and gently adjusted his physical position onto his side to ensure his airway remained completely clear. She looked around at the small crowd of onlookers that had finally begun to gather, loudly commanding someone to call for an emergency ambulance immediately. When the surrounding people merely stared back at her with blank, frozen expressions, she realized she had to take complete control of the situation herself. She quickly pulled her own cell phone from her purse, dialed the emergency number, and calmly provided the dispatcher with a highly precise medical description of the man's critical state. She detailed his fluctuating pulse, his fading level of consciousness, and their exact geographic location at the corner of the busy downtown intersection. After ending the call, she focused her entire attention back on Ethan, gently loosening the tight collar of his dress shirt to ease his breathing. She used her rolled-up jacket to slightly elevate his lower legs, doing everything within her power to combat the dangerous onset of physical shock. She kept her face directly within his field of vision, continuously speaking to him in a reassuring voice, pleading with him to keep his eyes open and stay focused on her words. The sound of approaching sirens finally echoed through the city streets, and within 5 minutes, a metropolitan ambulance pulled up sharply to the curb. The emergency medical technicians jumped out of the vehicle, rushing over to the scene with their equipment bags in hand. They recognized almost immediately, from Catherine's precise hand placement and professional terminology, that she was a highly trained individual. One of the young technicians quickly asked if she belonged to the medical profession, and Catherine quietly nodded as she helped them secure the oxygen mask over Ethan's face. She told them that she had spent years working as a paramedic, though she omitted the painful detail that she had recently been cast out of the profession. Without a second thought for her own personal schedule, she climbed directly into the back of the ambulance alongside Ethan, knowing that her detailed observations could save his life. During the rapid, chaotic ride to the nearest hospital, she continuously reported every slight shift in his vital signs to the attending medical team. The ambulance arrived at the emergency bay of the large hospital, with its lights flashing brightly, and Catherine helped guide the rolling stretcher through the sliding doors. She continuously communicated Ethan's cardiovascular instability to the intake nurses, ensuring that his medical chart reflected the exact timeline of his physical collapse. It was during this high-stakes moment that she suddenly looked up and saw Raymond stepping out from one of the private physician lounges. Her ex-husband froze in place, his eyes locking onto her face, and his expression instantly transformed into a mask of smug amusement and cold arrogance. When the head nurse informed Raymond that the newly arrived elderly patient required an immediate, comprehensive evaluation by a senior doctor, Raymond looked at the chart and deliberately hesitated. He crossed his arms over his white lab coat, stating in a dry tone that there were several other critical cases ahead of this one in the queue. Catherine felt a sudden rush of white-hot anger surge through her veins, but she forced herself to maintain absolute, professional composure for the sake of the fragile man on the stretcher. She stepped forward, looking Raymond directly in the eyes, and firmly stated that the patient was exhibiting clear signs of acute respiratory failure and cardiovascular distress. She argued that every single minute wasted could result in irreversible heart damage, refusing to back down under his intimidating glare. Raymond sneered openly, leaning in close to whisper that she no longer held a position at this institution and had absolutely no right to teach him how to practice medicine. Catherine refused to flinch, replying in a low, piercing whisper that she was not standing there for her own sake, but for the sake of a dying human being. She demanded that if he refused to perform his sworn duty as a physician, he should immediately step aside and transfer the case to a doctor who actually cared about human life. The intense, suffocating tension between them stretched on for several agonizing seconds, until a compassionate physician named Dr. Thomas stepped forward to intervene. Dr. Thomas had overheard the clinical details and immediately ordered the nurses to wheel Ethan into the primary resuscitation room for urgent treatment. Raymond turned on his heel and walked away with a look of pure fury, while Catherine retreated to the long, sterile waiting corridor to anxiously await news. She sat on a cold plastic chair for what felt like an eternity, her heart hammering against her ribs as she prayed for the old man's survival. When Dr. Thomas finally emerged from the treatment rooms an hour later, he smiled warmly and informed her that the patient's vitals had stabilized completely under medication. Catherine let out a massive sigh of relief, leaning against the wall as the crushing weight of the morning's anxiety finally began to lift from her shoulders. She took a few moments to help the administrative staff complete the detailed intake incident report, providing crucial historical data that would aid in Ethan's long-term recovery. It was only when she finally glanced up at the large clock hanging on the hospital wall that a sharp, icy hand of dread gripped her chest. The hands of the clock clearly indicated that the time was long past 10 o'clock in the morning, meaning her life-altering corporate interview had begun exactly 40 minutes ago. A profound sense of panic washed over her, Yet she refused to sprint out of the building until she personally confirmed that Ethan was fully conscious. She quietly walked back to his bedside, where the elderly man feebly reached out to squeeze her hand, whispering a sincere word of thanks. Catherine gave him a gentle, reassuring smile, telling him that he was in safe hands now, before turning around and running out of the hospital as fast as her legs could carry her. Catherine practically threw herself out of the hospital's rotating glass doors, desperately waving her hand to hail a passing yellow taxicab on the busy street. She climbed into the back seat, her heart pounding violently against her ribs as she provided the driver with the address of the massive corporate headquarters. During the frantic ride through the dense downtown traffic, she frantically tried to smooth down her hair and compose her racing thoughts, knowing the odds were completely against her. When she finally stepped into the polished marble lobby of the skyscraper, she looked at the grand clock and realized she was nearly an hour late. The receptionist looked at her with a cold, judgmental expression before speaking into an intercom and directing her to the top floor, where the chief executive officer's private office was located. Catherine entered the expansive room, finding Benjamin sitting behind a massive mahogany desk, his posture incredibly rigid, and his face completely unreadable. Before she could even finish introducing herself or offer an explanation, Benjamin raised a single hand to silence her, his voice cutting through the quiet room like a knife. He stated coldly that the interview had been strictly scheduled for 9 o'clock sharp, and that punctuality was the absolute foundation of his enterprise. Catherine took a long, stabilizing breath, refusing to allow her voice to tremble as she looked directly at the wealthy young businessman. She offered a sincere, deeply dignified apology for her tardiness, acknowledging that she had completely failed to meet his expectations for the morning. She could have easily explained every single detail of the medical crisis she had just managed on the public sidewalk. She could have spoken of the elderly man's collapse, the ambulance ride, and the life-saving measures she had performed, but she consciously chose not to use a man's life as a convenient excuse for her failure. She stood tall, stating with immense grace that she took full, undivided responsibility for her late arrival, and entirely understood if he chose to disqualify her application. Benjamin observed her closely for several silent moments, his sharp eyes analyzing her calm demeanor and her refusal to offer frantic, dramatic justifications. He spoke again, his tone completely devoid of warmth, stating that his company required absolute, unshakable discipline from every single employee, regardless of their rank. He declared that if a person could not manage to arrive on time for an interview that could change their life, they could never be trusted to manage daily corporate responsibilities. He formally announced that the interview was officially concluded, leaving Catherine with no choice but to gather her things and quietly exit the room. She walked out of the massive glass building, moving several blocks away into a quiet public park, before finally allowing the hot tears of frustration to flow freely down her face. She did not cry simply because she had lost a job, but because of the agonizing irony that doing the right thing had cost her the one thing she needed to survive. She felt completely defeated by a world that seemed to consistently reward cold calculatedness while harshly punishing genuine human empathy. Back at the Metropolitan Hospital, Ethan had regained his full consciousness and was sitting up in his medical bed, his strength rapidly returning under the care of the nurses. He firmly demanded that the attending staff provide him with the name and contact information of the extraordinary woman who had saved his life on the concrete sidewalk. Raymond, who happened to be reviewing charts near the nurses' station, overheard the elderly man's loud insistence and approached the bedside with a malicious, calculating smile on his face. He readily volunteered Catherine's full legal name and her exact home address, completely bypassing standard privacy protocols without a single shred of hesitation. In his twisted, bitter mind, Raymond assumed that providing her address to a wealthy, demanding old man would result in further harassment and complications for his ex-husband. He left the patient's room, whispering to himself that Catherine already had far too many problems to handle, fully believing his action would push her closer to financial ruin. Ethan, however, had absolutely no intention of causing her any distress. He carefully wrote the address down on a piece of paper, his eyes flashing with a deep, unshakable determination to find her as soon as he was discharged. Later that very same evening, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the city buildings and the neighborhood was growing quiet, a gentle knock sounded at Catherine's door. She was standing in her small kitchen, wiping down the countertops, and was certainly not expecting any visitors at such a late hour. She dried her hands on a worn dish towel, walked over to the door, and turned the lock with a cautious sense of curiosity. When she pulled the door open, she was completely stunned to find Ethan standing on the welcome mat, leaning heavily on a polished wooden cane. Though his face was still somewhat pale from the morning's physical ordeal, he looked remarkably stable and dressed in a fine, elegant overcoat. Catherine gasped slightly, immediately asking how he had managed to find her home, while opening the door wider to ensure he did not lose his balance. Ethan smiled softly, stepping into the clean apartment and explaining that he had felt an absolute moral obligation to thank her face-to-face for saving his life. Catherine shook her head gently, stating with complete sincerity that seeing him standing on his own 2 feet was more than enough reward for her. The elderly man reached deep into his coat pocket, pulling out a thick, unmarked white envelope and extending it toward her with a look of deep respect. He firmly requested that she accept the package as a genuine token of his immense gratitude, clarifying that it was absolutely not charity, but a well-deserved recognition of her valor. Catherine looked at the envelope but deliberately took a step backward, placing her hands behind her back and refusing to touch the money. She looked him directly in the eyes and explained that she could never accept financial compensation for performing an action that every single human being should naturally do for another. She stated that she had stepped forward to help him simply because it was the morally right thing to do, not because she was seeking a financial reward. Ethan tried to argue further, reminding her that her swift clinical intervention had literally kept his heart beating on a cold public sidewalk. Catherine maintained her unshakable posture, responding that a human life was entirely priceless, and that basic human kindness was not a commercial service that carried a price tag. The elderly gentleman stared at her in absolute awe, realizing that no amount of persuasion would ever convince this proud, ethical woman to compromise her core principles. He slowly placed the heavy envelope back into his pocket, and a comfortable silence settled between them for a few brief moments as they stood in the small living room. It was during this quiet moment that Catherine let out a soft, involuntary sigh, the immense exhaustion of her disastrous day finally breaking through her stoic exterior. She quietly murmured that she had unfortunately missed a monumentally important job interview that morning, as a direct result of the emergency timeline. Ethan instantly knit his silver brows together in deep concern, asking what specific kind of employment opportunity she had lost because of her selflessness. Catherine looked down at her neatly swept floor, admitting that it was a simple office cleaning position at a massive downtown corporation owned by a wealthy executive named Benjamin. Upon hearing that specific name, Ethan's entire facial expression shifted dramatically, his posture straightening with a quiet authority that he carefully kept out of his voice. He simply nodded, keeping his sudden realization entirely to himself, and concluded his visit by stating that he was deeply comforted to know people of her character still existed in the world. A few hours later, Ethan arrived at his own private residence, a magnificent, sprawling historic mansion located in one of Boston's most exclusive, affluent neighborhoods. He walked directly down the long hallway toward the grand executive study, where his son, Benjamin, typically spent his late evenings reviewing corporate financial sheets. He found the young billionaire sitting under the glow of a desk lamp, his face tightly drawn, in a look of immense irritation as he flipped through corporate files. Ethan quietly sat down in a leather armchair directly across from his son, asking in a casual tone how his corporate day had treated him. Benjamin let out a frustrated sigh, complaining bitterly about how exhausting his morning had been, specifically mentioning a careless cleaning applicant who had arrived incredibly late for her scheduled interview. He declared that he had absolutely no tolerance for such a flagrant lack of basic professional commitment and had dismissed her immediately. Ethan sat in absolute silence for several long moments, observing his son's rigid, unyielding expression before choosing to speak with absolute clarity. He softly asked if the young woman had attempted to explain the reason for her late arrival, and Benjamin replied that she had merely apologized without offering any dramatic excuses. The elderly man took a very long, deep breath, looked his son directly in the cold eyes, and revealed that the woman was late because she was busy saving his life. Benjamin slowly raised his head from his paperwork, his entire body freezing, as he asked his father exactly what he meant by that shocking statement. Ethan then recounted every single detail of his terrifying physical collapse on the downtown concrete sidewalk, emphasizing how dozens of wealthy, punctual citizens had walked right past his fallen body without a care. He described how Catherine had run to his side, utilizing her advanced paramedic skills to stabilize his failing heart, managing the scene, and refusing to leave his side during the ambulance ride. He detailed how she had stood up to a hostile doctor at the hospital, staying with him until his vital signs were completely secure, before rushing off to her interview. He pointed out that she could have easily abandoned him on the street to secure her own financial future. Yet she had chosen human life over personal gain. Furthermore, he highlighted the fact that when she finally arrived at the corporate office, she chose to preserve her personal dignity rather than weaponize an old man's medical crisis as a cheap excuse. Benjamin sat completely paralyzed behind his massive desk, his rigid facial expression slowly crumbling as the profound weight of his father's words washed over him. The young billionaire looked down at his desk, whispering in a voice filled with sudden shame that she had not uttered a single word about the emergency during their meeting. Ethan responded that a person of true, unshakable integrity would always prefer to face an unfair judgment rather than use someone else's suffering to shield themselves from blame. He reminded his son that he spent his entire life demanding absolute responsibility from his corporate employees. Yet when he finally met a person who embodied true responsibility, he had cast her out. The heavy silence that followed was filled with deep, painful reflection, as Benjamin realized the immense magnitude of his own arrogant mistake. He rubbed his face with his hands, looked up at his father, and quietly asked for the woman's name, to which Ethan proudly responded that her name was Catherine. The very next morning, before Catherine had even finished preparing Beatrice's school lunchbox, her old cellular phone began to ring loudly on the kitchen counter. She answered it with a cautious, guarded tone, only to be completely taken aback by the familiar, formal voice of Benjamin speaking on the line. The wealthy chief executive officer politely requested that she return to the corporate headquarters that morning, stating that he required a follow-up conversation regarding her application. Catherine hesitated for a brief second, her mind racing with confusion, but she maintained her composure and agreed to attend the meeting. When she arrived at the high-rise office building an hour later, the receptionist greeted her with a striking level of warmth and immediately escorted her to the top floor. Benjamin stood up from behind his massive desk the moment she entered the room, his previous cold arrogance completely replaced by a look of profound professional respect. He looked her directly in the eyes and stated that he had thoroughly re-evaluated the circumstances of the previous day, explaining that his company desperately needed leaders who possessed unshakable character. He formally offered her the cleaning position, but added that he had personally adjusted the contract to include a salary that was significantly higher than the standard starting rate. Catherine was completely stunned by the sudden turn of events asking with absolute sincerity if this unexpected offer had anything to do with her actions the previous morning. Benjamin gave a firm, honest nod, stating that while he respected her medical heroism, he was hiring her because she had chosen to take full responsibility for her lateness, rather than offer excuses. He declared that such rare strength of character was the most valuable asset any institution could ever hope to possess, and Catherine accepted the position with a proud, confident smile. Within a matter of days, Catherine was officially wearing the simple dark uniform of the corporate cleaning staff, throwing her entire heart and soul into her daily responsibilities. As she systematically organized the massive cleaning supply depots and mapped out her daily routes, she constantly reminded herself that this was her glorious opportunity to rebuild her life. She did not perform her tasks simply to impress the executives. She worked with an innate, unshakable sense of personal excellence because she truly did not know how to work any other way. Within her very first week, she completely revolutionized the disorganized corporate supply rooms, labeling every single item, creating inventory sheets, and eliminating massive amounts of waste. When Benjamin happened to walk past the storage areas and noticed the stunning transformation, he asked the supervisor who was responsible for the brilliant layout. The supervisor instantly pointed to Catherine, and the young CEO simply nodded in quiet appreciation, realizing his father's assessment of her talent had been entirely accurate. Meanwhile, Ethan had absolutely no intention of letting the injustices of the past continue to cast a dark shadow over Catherine's life. The wealthy, elderly gentleman traveled down to the Metropolitan Hospital, demanding an immediate, private audience with the chief executive board of the medical network. He officially revealed his prominent identity and filed a massive, formal complaint, detailing Raymond's deliberate refusal to provide immediate medical care during his cardiac emergency. The hospital board, terrified of the massive legal and financial public relations fallout from such a wealthy family, immediately launched a comprehensive internal investigation into Raymond's professional conduct. Within a few short days, a massive team of independent auditors began meticulously reviewing Raymond's historical patient charts, uncovering a horrifying pattern of medical negligence, altered records, and personal biases. Raymond was officially suspended from his medical duties, his previous high society arrogance instantly evaporating as his entire professional world began to rapidly crumble around him. The comprehensive internal investigation into Raymond's medical history advanced with a devastating speed, uncovering years of deeply buried professional misconduct that could no longer be hidden. When the medical board officially released its final verdict, the consequences were absolute. Raymond's medical license was permanently revoked, ensuring he could never practice medicine again. The proud, vindictive man found himself completely cast out of the prestigious medical community, his wealth, social status, and influential friendships vanishing into thin air within a single week. Consumido by an all-consuming fury, he desperately tried to contact Catherine, falsely believing she was the architect of his ultimate downfall. When she finally answered his call, he screamed bitterly that she had destroyed his life, but Catherine simply responded with a calm, piercing serenity. She told him that she had done nothing more than move forward with her own life, reminding him that his own corrupt choices and cruel actions had finally caught up to him. Meanwhile, Catherine's extraordinary organizational skills and natural leadership capabilities could no longer be contained within the boundaries of a simple cleaning role. Benjamin had been quietly monitoring her performance for months, noticing how she managed her small cleaning team with an incredible balance of firm discipline and profound human empathy. He formally summoned her to his office once again, but this time it was to officially offer her a major promotion to the position of Senior Administrative Coordinator for the entire corporate facility. He looked at her with a warm smile, stating that true competence could never be defined by a past job title, and that her unique gift for bringing order to chaos was exactly what his corporate offices required. Catherine accepted the promotion with tears of pure joy shining in her eyes, knowing that her long, painful journey through the darkness had finally led her to a place of absolute security. As we look back upon the grand, intricate tapestry of human existence, we begin to realize a profound truth, that only the accumulation of years and the wisdom of old age can fully validate. We live in a world that is frequently obsessed with the superficial metrics of speed, loud declarations of success, and the accumulation of fleeting material wealth. Yet, the deep, quiet reality of a truly successful life is always measured by the silent, unshakable strength of an individual's personal character when no one else is watching. True dignity is never something that can be granted to us by a prestigious professional title, nor can it ever be taken away from us by the cruel, vindictive actions of those who seek to do us harm. Like a solid oak tree that drives its roots deep into the dark earth to withstand the most violent winter storms, a person of genuine integrity stands entirely unmoved by the temporary hardships of fate. Every single moral choice we make in the hidden corners of our daily lives, whether we choose to stretch out a helping hand to a fallen stranger or choose to walk past in selfish haste, sets off a powerful, unseen echo across the universe. The path of honesty and moral righteousness is rarely the easiest or the most convenient route to travel, and it often demands that we swallow our pride and endure unfair judgments with a quiet, patient heart. However, time possesses a beautiful, inevitable way of bringing the absolute truth into the light, systematically dismantling the hollow fortresses built on arrogance while elevating those who have walked with humility. When an elder looks back over the long landscape of a life fully lived, they do not remember the expensive luxuries or the superficial praise of high society. They remember the moments they chose courage over convenience. They remember the times they stood firmly by their principles, refusing to compromise their soul for a handful of silver or a moment of cheap validation. Catherine and her beautiful daughter Beatrice ultimately found their peace not because they had escaped the trials of life, but because they had walked through the fire without losing a single shred of their humanity. Their small, warm home in Boston was no longer filled with the heavy silence of financial dread, but with the bright, resonant laughter of a secure future built entirely on the beautiful foundation of pure, unshakable decency.